Welcome to the Realm of Ideas is Free to All. This is episode 50, Emotional Character. These are a series of ruminations that I've been doing almost for a year now. They go back to the beginning of December in last year. So we've kind of reached a kind of landmark here with our 50th program. What's also nice is I've been really appreciated the work that Julie has done to promote the live stream, and that we're actually getting a decent amount of people. I really appreciate those people who are listening, those people who have subscribed, and the interest that they're showing in what we're doing. These are a series of ruminations that I do basically based on ideas that started with ideas relative and pertinent to my work, and then basically expanded out and included Julie. And this one is a kind of a fun one for me, because it's kind of something that's kind of part of what I feel is an important aspect of the creative work. And I get a chance to kind of like also cite from someone who I kind of have a tremendous amount of respect for, because I think he was like probably one of the greatest influences on 20th century art, if not art in general, since his work, and that's Freud. Anyway, I read a piece on Wednesday, which was the lead up to what we're going to talk about tonight. But let me kind of read a fuller portion of that. And it's from Dostoevsky and Parricide, which comes from Character and Culture. And there we go. So the creative artist is the least doubtful. Dostoevsky's place is not far behind Shakespeare. The Brothers Karamazov is the most magnificent novel ever written. The episode of the Grand Inquisitor, one of the peaks in the literature of the world, can hardly be valued too highly. Before the problem of the creative artist, analysis must, alas, lay down its arms. The moralist in Dostoevsky is the most readily assailable if we seek to rank him high as a moralist on the plea that only a man who has gone through the depths of sin can reach the highest summit of morality. We are neglecting a doubt that arises. A moral man is one who reacts to temptation as soon as he feels it in his heart without yielding to it, Freud says. A man who alternately sins and then in his remorse erects high moral standards lays himself open to the reproach that he has made things too easy for himself. He has not achieved the essence of morality, renunciation, for the moral conduct of life is a practical human interest. He reminds one of the barbarism of the great migrations who murdered and did penance for it, till penance became an actual technique for enabling murder to be done. Ivan the Terrible behaved in exactly this way. Indeed, this compromise with morality is a characteristic Russian trait. Nor was the final outcome of Dostoevsky's moral strivings anything very glorious. After the most violent struggles to reconcile the instinctual demands of the individual with the claims of the community, he landed in the retrograde position of submission both to temporal and spiritual authority, of veneration both for the Tsar and the God of the Christians, and of a narrow Russian nationalism, a position which lesser minds have reacted with smaller effort. This is the weak point in the great personality. Dostoevsky threw away the chance of becoming a teacher and liberator of humanity and made himself one of them. The future of human civilization will have little to thank him for. It seems probable that he was condemned to this failure by his neurosis. The greatness of his intelligence and the strength of his love for humanity might have opened to him another as apostolic way of life. So, one of the things I love about Freud is the fact that he probably valued the investigation of the character of an individual greater than any other person in history. I think that that laid a groundwork for a revolution in painting that took place late in the 18th and late in the 19th century and into the 20th century. The investigation of the unconscious certainly is a mainstay of the surrealist movement, but I believe there was a disquiet and a kind of uncomfortable nature that basically questioned a lot of the premises and formulations of that which laid out the institutional prescription for artists, certainly of painters. Interestingly enough, it was such a degree that if you think about it, the great painters of the 20th century all basically fell outside of institutions. They came from other fields, they taught themselves to paint, they basically understood these principles more so than painting itself. The ones that were greatest successful, in my opinion, were the ones that were able to kind of take their knowledge, their innate knowledge of painting, its techniques, and apply them in ways that basically could kind of deal with the formulations that the institutions were no longer able to keep up with. I think for me, the greatest flowerings of art in the 20th century were those of the surrealists. And I think for me, probably the greatest painter of the 20th century is Dali. And that's not taking anything away from Picasso. Picasso was a brilliant painter. So was, I used to believe, also was Paul Klee. But I feel that the ones who kind of made the deepest impressions were those who dealt specifically with the nature of character. And I think the nature of character and the abstractions that were necessary in order to get there took place because of the possibilities that were kind of raised by the idea of the unconscious. Anyway, with that as the introduction, we'll kind of basically continue on that. But first, we want to see what's new in Julie. So, Julie, can you want to give us an idea of what you've been up to and how we're doing?
No problem. May I?
Yes.
Hello. So, in continuing my drawing of an ancient Dutch capital, a walled city of canals, I'm actually using it to discuss the seed of scientific invention, because actually in this Dutch capital, Wallenberg, the optical lens was invented along with the earliest microscopes and the earliest telescopes. So it was the center of the Dutch East India Company, and that is important. Sure. Thank you. Mm-hmm. That is important because as a center of world trade in a time when goods were not exchanged over long distances, it was basically the Silk Road of Europe. And there was a small but very important group of Dutch painters who specialized in vanitas paintings of a most incredible nature. The objects they were able to actually gather and collect came from the travels of the Dutch East India Company, which had a major hub in Wallenberg, and in fact had their main shipping port there. So they had the most exotic shells, live animals, creatures, dried flowers, things from the tropics, all sorts of things that were incredibly hard to find. And all sorts of things that were incredibly hard to find. And they basically, included these all in. Yeah, if you'd like to hold it up, that would be great. This is my drawing thus far. It's a little bit of glare. Maybe if you went a little bit closer. Oh, that's good. And if you zoomed in on that's good. On the details, what I did was I really completed this frog on the left. Now, what is the substrate that I've chosen? An excellent question. And why are there frogs? There were specimens, dead and alive, of flora and fauna brought back. These were some of the earliest Kunstendammers. Well, that I think is a German word, but the Dutch had enormous cabinets of curiosities, and these were specimens they painted and collected. And some incredibly great Vanitas painters lived and worked in Wallenberg. So the piece I've chosen is actually in the American wing at the Met and is a very eccentric, large vase. But the vase, I would almost set it to Ralph Vaughan's Sea Symphony or his Symphonia Antarctica, because it's a bleak vase. It's absolutely huge. It's maybe about 3 to 4 feet tall, and it's full of stormy clouds and shipwrecks. And 2 frogs, one on either side, are actually holding up a tattered fisherman's net, which is done not as a painting on the vase. The frogs are 3-dimensional, life-size frogs, and the actual net was clay that does a really good impersonation of twine. And the reason is it is the very shape and exterior structure of the walled city of Wallenberg, with all of its canals and intricacies. And as the seed of science and culture, I'm morphing the man-made plan into the organic architecture of a scanning electron micrograph of an actual seed pod, which goes from that side, which is the city plan as it is and still is, to this very organic structure, which in fact is a seed pod. And the compartments are containing those things that are very vital and unique to a rather incredible place that I don't think most people have even ever heard of now. Yeah. In a nutshell.
Okay. All right. That's actually very pertinent to what we're kind of talking about.
Mm-hmm.
I think that one of the things that happens is over time, certain things give rise to certain possibilities and certain potentials. I think that the idea of Holland and this particular place being a place from which items were brought and distributed gives a certain character to that place, and opportunities basically arise. I think that the idea of the Vanitas comes about because of the incredible kind of peril that's inherent in coming about to these things. I mean, it wasn't something that was, these exotic things were kind of really part of an incredibly laborious and kind of treacherous journey that could bring you from the furthest reaches of what was known or comprehended back to your table. I personally love still life painting. I really love Vanitas. Vanitas is, for me, one of the greatest expressions of character and consequence that I've ever seen. And I think it's because people understood just how incredibly precious and also how incredibly fragile not just these things were, but how they became metaphors and expressions of life, or the kind of like the nature of what life was. So I think that it launches us into something we talked about briefly a few weeks ago when we talked about the difference between drawing and copying. And we talked about the fact that in a drawing, one hopefully understands the fact that the purpose is to express some kind of deep character as opposed to something that was a resemblance. Art has art has kind of advanced by understanding a deepening of the consequence of character as an expression and finding ways to make valuable, reasonably consequential abstractions in order to get at that. I think that the dream landscape as a way to express the unconscious was a brilliant abstraction and a great canvas on which many great painters basically took upon this understanding of the human mind and the expression of this thing, the expression of the human mind as an aspect of our culture. And it's something that I don't know if we can really say we see a parallel in history. So, with that said, Julie, do you want to give us some examples of your best examples of character as an expressed in kind of literature, music, art, opera, whatever you kind of feel?
Yes. I'll start with opera because opera is the grand palette of the human psyche. That's what I call it.
Mm,
Actually, I haven't heard
mhm.
anyone else say
No, that
that.
sounds good.
Yeah. So opera, I'll say it again, as the grand palette of the human psyche. It's not a cartoon, it's not a pantomime. And I think people misunderstand opera and hence misunderstand the characters expressed within the art form of opera. And this is a very key point. These are not cartoon exaggerations. These are powerful, volatile, compelling distillations. And when you have a cartoon version of something, you shed its individuality, you shed its uniqueness, you shed its specificity. In opera, all these things are distilled. They're boiled down, they're rapier sharp, they're caustic, they're an unctuous liquid. They're very, very intense. And one of the finest characters and one of my favorite operas is the namesake Turandot. And Turandot basically is a queen, is a woman who is almost fated to live the horror of the torture and rape and murder of an ancestral queen or princess who was her ancestor, who was captured by an invading horde, and she has set out to punish every man ever since. So all of her suitors, for those unfamiliar with the story, come to claim her hand if they answer the riddles that she poses. None can. They're all beheaded, except for Calaf, who does answer. And anyway, it's a really fascinating tale, but it is not simply a tale of a woman scorned or anything like that. This is the pageant of grand history with the massive, with the massive invasion of armies and the ruination of crowns and sovereigns and epic vengeance. And it's an incredible story, but it doesn't sacrifice the intimacy of love between two individuals, Turandot and Calaf, and a very tender, very paradoxical kind of a relationship develops between the two that is so heartbreaking and so twisted at the same time. It's a very twisted story. So it's tender and twisted, and that's really hard to pull off.
Mm,
And it's also grand and opulent.
mm.
Have to get a bottle of water. Hang
Okay.
on.
Here's water right here.
That's okay.
Okay. Okay. So in my case, I
don't
would
even have
like to
enough
kind of bring
time.
up the character of, since it was talking about Dostoevsky, the character of Prince Mishkin, and I think I've spoken briefly about him in other places. But to me, what was brilliant about the character of Prince Mishkin, and it does kind of relate something to what Freud was saying, was the fact that in spite of experience, Mishkin maintains innocence. And that is something that I realized as a young man was an incredibly kind of like brilliant idea. Most times, experience embitters, it breaks, it ruins, and there's a nature of innocence that basically is swept away as a result of the kind of harsh experience. Now, in this case, it wasn't kind of like a moral dilemma. Basically, it was in the pursuit of love and the kind of neurotic nature of Prince Mishkin. But as a result, staying pure to his soul, he continues to kind of pursue with great innocence love at his expense. And at the end, I won't give. I mean, this is something Julie and I talk about. Is like, when we're telling timeless stories, we wonder, it's like, are we telling people and they're understanding for the first time? I mean, one of the things that was really kind of interesting was that when I was learning opera, I felt it was important to kind of learn some of the stories before I actually went and kind of witnessed it. I kind of felt like there was a need to prepare oneself and to kind of educate oneself before one could basically just kind of saunter into the theater to listen. But I think in the case that you read the book, it's definitely a book worth reading, and I think that consequence of understanding how Dostoevsky shows and illustrates this idea of the character of this individual by the way in which, in spite of harsh experience, this individual maintains a tremendously kind of like innocent nature. And I think we'll talk in a couple of weeks about, where is it? The beauty of original ideas in January, which maybe I'm going to move that up because it seems too far away. Because I think we're really kind of in the verge of talking about it now. Character is one of the things I find really distressing when I speak with artists, architects, writers, is the lack of musicians, is the lack of a desire to understand the consequential original ideas of our time. It's as if we've forgotten that that's the essence of what we're basically given as our task. That's our task. Our task is, as individuals, to be able to kind of find that which are the expressions of our time in greatest, most consequential form. But what I find is more an obsession with technique. Now, again, when I say an obsession with technique, everybody say, "Oh, Bruce, you're not anti-technique." I'm not anti-technique, and I do adore, the lavish kind of consequences of beautiful technique. But what I feel is sometimes we realize the technique is not an end in itself, but it's been made to be such that we've forgotten our greater purpose. And that greater purpose is the expression of character. Now, character we understand as something that may be assigned to an individual. That person is of fine character, that person is elegant or whatever. But the point is not just that in that simple term. It's the character of expressing the nature of the individual as well as human nature itself. And that's what I think is lost as an actual investigation. So, thoughts?
Yeah, getting back to the character, getting
Mm-hmm.
back to the main point. Um, I would say actually that people overlook comedic characters as truly memorable, meaningful, insightful characters. Comedy now is mostly a throwaway. It's a series of gags on, you know, TikTok. It doesn't have the heft or the weight or the narrative that it used to have. The surrealist aspect of comedy, and I'm talking about the Marx Brothers, Robert Benchley, Monty Python, Jacques Tati. These were comedians who expressed through indelible, unforgettable characters more truths about what was going on in the world, in their city, in the minds of people, in the society, changes that were taking place, an overhaul in consciousness is really expressed very often in humor, much more palpably, much more effectively. I will give two very clear examples of this. If anyone has seen, and it's amazing how few people have seen Jacques Tati films now, Mr. Hulot's Holiday is a brilliant film. Uh, and it was post World War II France and trying to heal and recover. France's economy was in horrible shape. I mean, the war had decimated Paris and the cities, but people were still trying to have lives that had some measure of fun or contentment. And it seems like, on the surface, a very light film about, people in the city going to the seaside, to enjoy the beach. But it's very, very insightful about the mindset of France, the changes that were going on in the government, in society, how people were coping with the aftermath of World War II. It galvanized a kind of hope in the human spirit, and his character was an innocent. And I would compare Jacques Tati's character to Prince Mishkin, which is where I was going with this. He would cause people no end of grief very often, but never knowingly, not maliciously. He was very self-centered, but in the way that he sought what he wanted, but what he wanted didn't hurt anyone. It was almost like a child that wants, without really understanding that he might be making an enormous amount of noise, or freeing all the horses in the barn, or giving everyone a flat tire, or ruining a tennis game. Maybe he sank all of the boats. These are all things that happened. Or showing up late for a meal when all the food is gone and the table is still set, and he can't understand where all the waiters are and the chefs. It's hilarious, but it's incredibly insightful into the French character in transition and the aftermath of the tragedy of World War II.
Yeah, I kind of sense that, and I would say that's an interesting parallel. But one of the things I always found interesting was at least the psyche of the French spirit, rather than the kind of British stiff upper lip thing, was to kind of remain in France kind of somewhat not resigned, but willing and tolerant of change. And there was a kind of I wouldn't say an excitement, but there was a kind of like an understanding of the necessity of it. And there was a kind of innocence and patience with which they kind of like acted in this kind of case. It's interesting. I kind of think of a parallel with the fact that Mr. Bean, on the other hand, is quite malevolent.
Oh, extremely.
And quite kind of.
He's very mean-spirited.
Very mean-spirited,
Yeah.
and he's very callous. I mean, Mr. Hulot is not in any way callous or
he
careless.
Isn't innocent.
No, he basically does foolish things.
Yeah, they are foolish.
But when he is seen to be in error, he's gracious and apologetic.
Yeah.
Whereas Mr. Bean is divisive and callous and self-serving.
Pretty cowardly too.
And yes, exactly. I never liked the Bean character. I always found it very distasteful. And I found that the humor basically was always very vindictively at someone's expense.
Yeah.
Mr. Hulot does not do that. I mean,
Yeah.
there's humor, and it's a very self-effacing, kind of like, well, we're doing our best to adapt to this. We're all in this together, and we'll get through it.
Well, I mean, a great example of this is in when they're all going on a picnic, and his car, which is a jalopy, had a flat, and he goes to actually fix it. It's sticky, and it picks up all of the leaves and the twigs that are on the ground, and his car breaks down right in front of a funeral. And it's a funeral of some super rich person, and the chauffeur thinks it's a funerary wreath and takes his spare tire and actually brings it and, like, puts it on the coffin. And he sort of turns and he's just floored, but he didn't mean to offend, and he didn't
No, it was a misunderstanding.
to show any disrespect for the dead, but then it's too late and he can't do anything. But instead of ruining a funeral and making the grieving people grieve more, he simply, abandons his car because he can't drive it.
Exactly.
So,
whereas the Bean character would have found some way to
sabotage
to basically
or get
what he needed at the expense of everyone, even those people grieving a lost soul. Yeah. And I think, these are the kind of things, and again, not to be offensive, but it's like, I remember we had a case where Julie was tasked with a portrait, and it was after
this was funny.
Julie had kind of very much restored a character in me by identifying a character which I did not realize was operating. I was going through a difficult circumstance in my life, and during the creation of, was it the Reign of the Speculist? No, it was Rise of the was it
Reign of the Speculist.
Reign of the Speculist. Reign of the Speculist showed me a part of my character that I had thought had been left behind or had been abandoned, but Julie saw was still evident and present. And by seeing that, it galvanized me at a time when I most needed it. And it was so clear, so evident. I said, "Do you see that?"
Yes, I do.
And you said, "Yes, I do." I said, "Well, it's not a coincidence then if you see it."
Well, I
because it wasn't so. Because again, we hadn't at that point. We're not really together all that long, maybe.
No.
And I thought to myself, well, I mean, I've left this impression anyway.
I not only saw it, I could manifest what I
saw,
so you could see it.
Exactly. So the thing was interesting,
which I
was
couldn't
that
have done if I didn't see
it was a fairly heroic character, even though I did not see myself in that way at the moment. I did come to understand that at least that character was within me. So anyway, this individual kind of like
he commissioned me to
a portrait. And then
he'd seen my work, so he knew.
Right, he also knew what it was. Yeah, exactly. And he
know.
kind of. But I think what happened was when it was done, and basically he was kind of portrayed as Julie saw him, and he said, "Well, it doesn't paint me in a very heroic stance." And Julie said, "Well, I don't see you in a heroic way." And the reality was he wasn't a heroic character. He wasn't even an anti-hero. No, he wasn't. He was kind of like he was kind of a really kind of despicable, buffoonish, like malevolent.
Yeah, he was really
a malevolent, low life. And then turn out later that he actually proved to be worse than we even imagined.
Yeah.
But it was like one of these things where
he was real scumbag.
He was, but I think what happens is, the great thing about portraiture is it kind of does convey, if done well, the nature of the individual.
It unmasks people who do not wish to be seen.
Right. So I think it's one thing when you have,
him.
Yes, you warned me else. I was like, hey, look, you may not like the result, and I think, and you said not technically, but emotionally. And I think one of the things that's been interesting was that when we had been drawing at Cooper in the Cooper drawing studio, the alumni studio, they had models that were very unimpressive,
Yeah,
and
they were bland and boring.
they were
There was
bland
nothing
and
to
boring.
them.
And we found that when we went to the Met, there was so much more visceral nature in the things that we encountered, and I think that's kind of like one of the things that's very, very important in understanding that. Two pieces. One is the Rembrandt painting of the individual in the golden kind of fleece outfit. And then there's the
I
kind of
mean, the
flink,
man in the
the
turban.
man in the turban.
Yeah,
And then there's the flink Trony,
yeah,
right? And the interest between these two things is one, the man in the turban clearly looks like an artist model
yeah.
who basically is kind of being
He's
posed
dressed in a very
exactly,
elaborate
and
costume.
the painting looks like the painting of an individual who's been dressed up in a costume.
I mean, it's a brilliant painting. It's just
technically
luscious
brilliant,
and
yeah.
it's
But the point is,
fascinating. Yeah.
it in fact it doesn't hide its reality,
Yeah,
because what it
that's
is it says this is a painting of an individual
Mhm.
in a costume.
Mhm.
This individual is not this person, will never be this person, and that is really the reality of that painting. Whereas the flink piece basically expresses a kind of deep character of an individual with the intention of as what a Trony is, of expressing deep character. I mean, he has a kind of complexity and an intricacy of nature that is unmistakable. And, interestingly, I mean, one is kind of a big, majestic piece in terms of the fact it's given its own wall, whereas the Flink's Trony is kind of thrown off into a corner. And as a result, if you come into the room and you might initially look at the pieces, you may say to yourself, well, oh my God, this is a magnificent piece, and it's
It's also
very,
huge, and the other one
yes,
is
exactly,
relatively small. But
I mean, I think it's even
size has nothing
yes,
to do with it.
no, true. I mean, like it's in the same room as the Rembrandt self-portrait,
Mhm.
which is one of the 5 most important pieces I believe that the Met owns.
Yeah.
But the thing is, I believe the Flink piece might even be smaller than the self-portrait, whereas the man in the turban
It is.
is several times larger than the self-portrait. But it does not carry the weight of either of the other two paintings or some of the other, I mean, brilliant Van Dycks that are next door and around at the same time. I mean, so what is it that's the nature of character? What is it about something that makes you feel as if you want to try to understand and appreciate an individual? What would you say if you were asked? What intrigues you? What draws you to individuals?
Well, what draws me to particular individuals is to find out what fuels them, if something does. Where is the simmering place from which their ideas take spark? And you can't say that about a lot of people because they don't have very interesting ideas. Those few individuals I do find interesting. This guy here.
Thank you, Pete.
Sure. I'll be honest, I find most people incredibly boring. Being
Can't say disagree.
completely frank, but um, even it, and one doesn't have to know one. Let me take an example of a Van Dyck piece, and I am passionate about Van Dyck as a painter, as a conjurer of really pointed, really well defined individuals. You don't have to know the entire history of, say, Lucas van Uffel, which is, I think, one of the greatest portraits ever painted, to glean really important aspects of his character. He, I believe, was a merchant, but he was not just a trader. He was a cartographer. He was a lutist. He was a calligrapher. He was a botanist. He was incredibly accomplished. He was a seaman. I mean, He traveled the world. He collected interesting objects. He was very learned. So the portrait shows a man always in motion. He sets sail at his desk, at his table. There's a swirl of his black cloak, and it swirls out as if he is a billowing sail as he sits. I'm sorry, it's me. Allergies. He is turned over his shoulder, and the position of his fingers and hands are fascinating because they're poised almost like a land crab turning into a compass. He is his map, and his body are the tools of his own cartography. He is poised, always on the edge of adventure, always on the edge of what clearly was a very adventurous mind. He was extremely well versed, very, very literate, very, very articulate, and all of this is gleaned in that portrait.
Interesting, because I was on a project a few weeks ago, and it turns out that the building that was built, I think, in 1911, and then was renovated in 1927, was originally the home of Pan Am before it moved into Grand Central.
Well, that's interesting.
And interestingly, one of the things that you see is that when you're talking about the city, what's the name of the city again?
Oh, Wallenberg.
Wallenberg.
Let me get the
Is that the thing about Wallenberg? It happened to be the hub of this reality where the European shipbuilders and navigators had basically come to the point where they could explore a greater degree of the world and bring back precious treasures that had only maybe been dreamt or heard about, but had never ever been seen. In a way, when I think of those times in the 1960s when Pan Am existed, Pan Am was the airline that took the first kind of like commercial corporate entities across the globe. And, there was that iconic blue and white kind of plastic Pan Am bag.
Sorry, I got the name wrong. It's Middleburg.
Sorry. But you remember that kind of like iconic Pan Am logo and that iconic Pan Am bag that had the logo, the blue and white emblazoned on it.
I think they should see it because it's real. I'm sorry. It's Middleburg. I was mixing. I didn't get a lot of sleep.
So I kind of
wait. We can show these side by side, and that is the beauty of this, right? There we go.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
hand me this.
I think that we see that just the same way that the individual who was navigating the globe in this time, in the kind of, I guess it was like, this is like the 1700s, right? This is the time when we're starting to see in the 17th century, around the time of Rembrandt and these people, the beginning of this kind of individual who is getting a knowledge of these things that are kind of being emerged in the world.
Here we go.
But in a way, when was it painted?
1637.
All right, so 17th century.
Here.
The century of genius, as described by.
Are you able to see it?
By Whitehead. Whitehead describes the 17th century as the century of genius.
This is the piece.
Right. So anyway, I think one of the things that's true is that in this time, complex individuals were developing complex character, and it was interesting to kind of see these things depicted around that time. So that the idea was there was a benefit, of course there was the need to glorify those in power. But at the same time, there was in the Dutch case, more of an identification of what I guess would be called the entrepreneurs or the characters who basically appreciated this idiom of understanding the nature of movement on the globe and the discovery of these kind of precious, fragile, and vital things. So as time went on, you kind of came to see that as that nature of that age. And I think that the 17th century certainly was a century of genius. It was a century where mathematics kind of really started to come to appreciate its ability to kind of manifest an understanding of the mercantile, financial, and kind of like artistic worlds in order to kind of lay the groundwork that would allow people to kind of understand the analysis and the motions that they would discover in the way in which they moved about in a way they hadn't moved about previously. So in that case, it's not an arrogance or kind of like or a kind of dismissal of individuals. It's just that history has defined identifiable moments of consequence where individuals who could be seen were capable of understanding and comprehending and kind of enlisting in the existence of that moment in a way that expresses itself deeply in a kind of complex character. And it doesn't mean that there aren't people today who kind of don't have complex character. It's just the fact that the average person who is you're usually going to be your kind of artist model is not really going to embody that to that degree.
They don't have any real character. They are usually very bland and
so so I think in that case it's difficult at this moment to find those people who you can express. And of course, what happens in art school is that the students always do the self-portrait of them in this kind of brooding Byron-esque way. And it's kind of trite because you're like, it's possible that, these people will develop the ability to have that kind of emotional maturity and emotional capability and can develop into that thing. But at the same time, it's like there isn't the same circumstance that kind of dictates that possibility.
Well, yeah, I'd like to make a distinction
Same.
when you're done between a facade and a true character. And that's exactly it. We've seen hundreds of student portraits with that kind of staring, brooding, and they're all looking in a mirror and scrutinizing themselves in a very almost comical way, but it's not meant to be comical. It's meant to be a very serious, very, very searing self-portrait. Unfortunately, it doesn't.
Can I say one thing?
Sure.
What if the assignment was start to discover your character?
Well, that's
rather than saying, show us your most deep, dense, existential, kind of like trembling.
Yeah. Well.
But what if one was to say, as I develop as an individual, from 17, 18 years old as a freshman in college, what are the things I start to use drawing to investigate myself? Sorry, that was it. So go ahead. Sorry.
Sorry, I kind of lost my train of thought.
Oh, sorry, P.
Yeah. Well, I'll go on to something else.
Wait. Let me backtrack. What were we saying? Sorry.
Well, I was trying to make a point that the facade one might put on is like a Venetian mask.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it might look very exotic, almost menacing or fantastical, but often the person wearing it is very banal, very mundane. And a quotidian face under a fascinating mask does not make that person a fascinating character. And the point is that if a student maybe is not set yet to look inward, they might do a much more fascinating outward portrait rather than an ersatz look inside. It's not really a look inside. But I was going to also make a point about humor and the definition of character. Let's take Harpo Marx or Groucho. There are characters, people still know their faces now. Their characters are ingrained in the psyche of anyone worth their salt. And I heard someone say recently, who is Groucho Marx? It was this dopey guy in his 20s. Now, that's kind of a problem. You don't have to be a person in your 40s, 50s, 60s, or 70s to know who the Marx Brothers are. And I'm not saying were, because they are and should be more in the consciousness now of everybody than they were even then. The idea of a blithe spirit, of courage, and an anarchistic, in a funny way. They weren't trying to take over the government, far, far from it. They were rogue individualists just trying to live their lives under some very oppressive situations. They were in colleges. They were in Fredonia. I mean, they were, dealing with oppressive governments, the ridiculousness of the bureaucrats at an opera company, and A Night at the Opera, probably the funniest film ever made, ever.
I would say, I would agree with that.
Right. And their characters were not just kind of foppish children. They were very sharp, very pointed, but they had a surrealist sense of humor that gave their characters an otherworldly quality that made everything on earth that much more in focus, that much sharper. It was a dissection, but of a very different nature.
True. And another thing that I kind of remember fondly was, I remember kind of like when I came across the existentialist writers, and I was always so driven in appreciating the nature of which they talked honestly and openly about who they were and what their true intentions were. They exposed the raw nature of themselves in their characters. And in a time when I think now people are not even trying to kind of appreciate and understand who they are, the age of self-reflection, I think, is dead. But I don't know if we're ever going to see that come back. I think people are, one, too emotionally frail, and two, too invested in their personas to kind of ever kind of like possibly risk that breaking. But I think in that causes a dilemma for the artists. And I think also what happens is, like I said before, I mean, the great thing about the early 20th century in art was that painting basically emerged from individuals who had expressed desires for things of a greater challenge, allowed themselves to kind of go off in those investigations and left the institutions behind. And I think there's a prescription of expression, I would call it, and there's a personal one and there's an institutional one, and these two balance for understanding and control. And I think when the institutional one becomes inertial, the individuals will personally kind of go off on their own. When there's no longer a compelling nature in the institutional prescription, individuals will kind of take upon themselves to make it for themselves what they feel is important. And I think that's kind of something that kind of gives me hope in the nature of genius in the human spirit, because I don't believe institutions are great at prescribing kind of like character or expression. One of the conversations I've been having recently with colleagues in the education side is the incredible homogeneity with which students kind of seem to be kind of pressed out now. And we were looking at the fact that there really wasn't that intention on the part of the institutions.
It's a dull, uninspired mold over and over.
Yes, and I think that part of that, I mean,
tragic.
the nature of that, I think, comes from the institutions and the people that they hired to lead. And I remember one of the things I loved about when I was in college was the character of the capabilities of the individuals that were enlisted to be professors. You wanted to listen to certain people and you didn't care about listening to others. you were drawn to the conversations, you were drawn to the individuals, you were drawn to those provocative individuals who basically kind of could hold everyone's attention. And unfortunately, somewhere at the end of the 80s and the 90s, those individuals were kind of chased out by kind of like what I would call policy decisions. And now I think that those people who kind of played it safe and were not threatening have basically kind of managed to generationalize this idea of a homogeneity of mediocrity. And it's a sad thing, but I think that's what happens. I mean, I've never really seen I mean, I guess maybe in some places I've seen a prescription of expression that's institutional, but I think that for the most part, art comes by having faith in the individual artist to do what they feel makes sense. And I think that we're on we're on the beginning of that again. And I see that impatience in architecture. I see it in painting. I see it in music. I'm not sure if I see it in dance. I think it's possibly very possible that it's in dance because I think a lot of the great institutions. Well, I mean, Balanchine was a great institutional expression, and I think that was something that people can look upon in the fact that there was a great tradition there.
Mm-hmm.
You know, but there are very few. Anyway, so as we wrap up our final thoughts, it's funny. I kind of thought at one point I thought it was going to be hard to fill the time here, but actually not at all.
It needs part 2.
Maybe we'll do a part 2, but not for a while because we have other things we need to get to. So,
okay.
Yes.
Try and wrap your heads around this. When you get a piece of beautiful information and it's so staggering, it's all you can think about.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I hear very few people say that or crave that. I crave that.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm still working on Prussian blue. I found out some fascinating things, but I'll save that for a chromatographic episode, which we should do, on the nature of color and foundational color. There is, in fact, a ripe and hardy narrative to every color, and I don't mean simple colors. Anyway, here's something that will be staggering. The town of Middleburg in 1675 had a population of only 27,000. Not a huge, but out of the 27,000 people, hundreds upon hundreds of them were incredible characters. The lists go on and on of vanitas painters, scores of them, scientists, engineers, architects, sculptors, writers, journalists, people who were the bishops and the ministers who founded churches, the philosophers and scientists. You know, this guy, one in particular, was an art advisor and an architect and a miniaturist and a courtier and a diplomat. So, like, the list goes on and on of what these people did. These are characters, and no one has heard of them now. That's what I wanted to say.
Good.
And we didn't even get to the scientists.
No, exactly. And in fact, this might be something we can definitely work into next week. Next week on the 16th of November, we're going to be talking about artifice and imitation. And that's going to be episode 51. So I want to say just briefly, this is the 87th anniversary of Kristallnacht, which basically kind of like is very much in my memory, given the kind of state of current affairs. And I hope that we're not repeating ourselves, but I kind of fear that we are. Anyway, so on that note, we're going to try to leave on something positive. The realm of ideas is free to all, and it's to the benefit of all for us to keep it that way. Stay free, my friends.